Greetings. Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us for our first lecture of the year. I'm Danielle Allen, the director of the Edmund J. Stafford Center for Ethics. And as you know, we work broadly in the area of ethics and public affairs. We are launching for this year and next year concentrated engagement with the theme of political economies and justice. And it's a great pleasure to be able to launch with our first lecture tonight with Professor Dani Rodrik. Before I get to Dani and introducing him, let me just also remind you that our next lecture, let's see if I get this right, is Thursday, October 12th. Good, great, yay. Okay, Martin O'Neill in Fong Auditorium. Okay, so mark your calendars and come along. So Professor Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an internationally renowned development economist. He's distinguished amongst the tribe of economists for his capacity to put political questions together with economic questions. So he's got a much richer, I would say, political understanding of the structures of our economy than one often finds, articulated by economists, if I can say that about your fellows in your discipline. He was, of course, one of the people to call attention to structural problems in the global economy in the late 1990s, well before other people started noticing. So calling attention to problems with the free flow of capital and so forth prior to the 07-08 crash, but also calling attention to what he calls the trilemma, the seeming impossibility of combining an integrated global economy with democracy and national sovereignty. Those are three things we think we aspire to, but it's not clear that they fit together in a single package. More recently, Dani's been thinking, among other things, about the place of values and normative thinking in economic processes. And so that has been part of the reason that we've very much always enjoyed conversation with one another. But he's an incredibly imaginative, thoughtful scholar, and it's a pleasure to be able to have him with us today again for our first lecture for this year's series, speaking about globalization without globalism. You're in for a treat. So, Dani.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you for the invitation. It's really very nice to be able to address this crowd. And I'm doing so as an economist and being perfectly aware that I'm just an amateur, and I'm going to overreach in a number of different ways. I hope you will be kind with me as I reach into ethics and political theory. Not at all being trained in either field. But this is, I'm going to be talking about a range of issues that have been preoccupying me for quite some time. And this is really, as I think Danielle's introduction indicated, it's really trying to understand the relationship between economics and politics in the contemporary world, and in particular, trying to make sense of sort of the tension between the politics of our current world, which is mostly local and national, and our economics, which is, of course, increasingly international. The concrete form of this tension that I'm going to be addressing is going to be the tension between economic globalization and democracy. I want to be a little bit clear about when this tension does arise and when it doesn't arise. And I'm going to be developing the distinction using an extended thought experiment, very concrete set of circumstances that helps me at least distinguish different kinds of circumstances, and I think helps me at least make some important distinctions about where precisely the source of the tension is and where we might identify it. And then if we are able to identify it, then we might actually be able to say something about to what extent we can reconcile economic globalization with democracy without doing much damage to democracy for sure. But I think by the end of the talk, I'll also come to the conclusion that if we think about it the right way, we won't be doing too much damage to economic globalization either. Now, globalism, by which I mean a somewhat different kind of an ideology, which I put in the title mostly because I was interested in thinking about what it meant, I think is another matter. I'm not going to say much about globalism per se, but I think it'll be implicit in my discussion, and perhaps we can get back to it as a separate category in the question and answer discussion. So let me jump right into this alleged tension between democracy and globalization. Now, there's one version of this tension which you get from, let's say, if you read the Public Citizen's website on discussion on trade, for example, and this version is about how rules that emerge from the international market, the practices of economic globalization, effectively constrain domestic policy space and reduce the scope for what domestic policy makers can do, and reduce the scope of institutional diversity that's feasible. Now, stated as such, I don't think this is a very good or a very satisfactory statement of the tension, because there are a lot of ways in which democracies constrain themselves, and not all of them need to be harmful to the practices of democracy. In particular, in the political science discipline, in American political science and comparative politics, it's the notion of democratic delegation, that the notion that democratically elected governments can constrain themselves by delegating powers to independent bodies, and in doing so, essentially improve the functioning of democracy without harming the principle of democratic decision making. And in the international context, thinking about globalism, thinking about globalization and global multilateral institutions, the argument has been extended by Cohen, Macedo, and Moravchik to the argument that says, look, the usual way we think about how democracy constrains, how globalization constrains democracy isn't right, because in fact, what the global order does, in particular the global economic order, as represented by global multilateral institutions and the rules of economic globalization, essentially enhance the functioning of democracies, and do so in three particular ways. One is that these rules enable the offsetting of factions, that is, they restrain special interests. So think about protectionists who would otherwise take control of domestic policy, but international trade agreements help restrain the power of factions. It might empower minority rights, protecting minority rights. Think about the sort of human rights regime, global human rights norms. And thirdly, these international rules might enhance the quality of democratic deliberation, for example, by forcing governments to actually justify their actions to others, by enforcing rules of transparency, accountability, and so forth in an international kind of a context. And I think those are all good and valid points. The problem, of course, is that, that just because a given multilateral regime can enhance the functioning of democracy doesn't mean that necessarily it will, or that our current rules exactly perform this function, or that the balance of those forces works out in exactly the same way, because for each one of these three arguments of Cohen et al., one can come up with examples that where the multilateral system or the economic globalization does exactly the opposite. That is to say, that it empowers the barbarians rather than restraining them. Think about intellectual property rights rules and patents and copyrights. It does not protect minority rights, or that it actually might deteriorate the quality of democratic deliberation, because many international agreements, for example, are just presented to the electorate in a take it or leave it kind of a basis, not allowing for a significant amount of deliberation and so forth, so might undermine democracy in that kind of a way. So this is a good entry point, but doesn't exactly get us to where I want to be, which is sort of having a more finely tuned appreciation of where exactly this tension might lie. Now, to dig just a slight step deeper, I find it helpful to make a distinction between two types of global rules, or global, again, when I talk about global rules, I'm talking about essentially economic globalization and the practices that emanate from that. So we can distinguish between global rules that are designed to address genuine problems of democratic politics. And so this would be, for example, commitment mechanisms that addresses time inconsistency, rules that stimulate transparency, rules that restrain special interests, and so forth. And then global rules that aggravate democratic malfunction. And how might that aggravation happen? It would happen by strengthening the bargaining leverage of special interests, or more specifically, the point at which I want to sort of get into the discussion in a more substantive way, by undermining social contracts that exist within societies. Now, so what do I mean by social contracts and the potential role that globalization might play in undermining social contracts? I view social contracts in part, at least at least social contracts that relate to the way that a market society is organized. I view it as a set of rules that tell us what kind of market transactions the society condones, and what kind of market transactions are blocked, and how exactly rules impinge on that market society. Now, in a domestic setting, in a national setting, the answers that we as a society give to this question about how we constrain and shape and institutionalize the market through various rules are codified in our laws and regulations, but of course they are also constantly evolving. But if you want to sort of find what they are essentially embodied in our existing rules of regulation. So every society have sort of rules with respect to how labor markets function and how they're constrained through various kinds of regulations, whether they're minimum wage laws, or whether they're particular labor standards and regulations with respect to hiring and firing of workers, with respect to safety. Similarly, in the financial sphere, banking and finance, a wide range of prudential regulation and financial standards regulate the way that what participants in financial markets are allowed to do and not do, and their responsibilities. Similarly, of course, in the environmental arena, product safety, health, and other kind of regulations. And of course, our sort of public finance arrangements in terms of how much redistribution, how much taxation, all of that. These are all embodiments of our understanding of how exactly we institutionalize the market, and what kind of transactions we allow, which kinds of transactions we block. Now, different nations are going to have different rules about all of these things, and they arise from a number of different roots. They might arise from different circumstances that, for example, countries at different levels of development may naturally have very different kinds of rules with respect to banking and finance. They might have very different tax systems. And these will arise both because the capacity of the states are different. They'll also arise because what the needs of societies at different levels of development are. Alternatively, they might arise from differences in consumer preferences, in preferences of society. Many questions about regulations are really questions about how you're going to be trading off different kinds of risk, and how you think of them. And if the French or the Europeans think that GMOs are not safe, regardless of what the scientific literature say, because they're applying a somewhat more stringent criterion, that doesn't necessarily make it a less valid argument for their kind of regulation than what the Americans believe in, and similarly with hormone-fed beef and other issues that have become trade issues later. because circumstances are different, preferences are different, but also because of valid reasons having to do with experimentation. Since these different rules are ways of responding to underlying preferences and circumstances, and they can be anything. Every healthy society is going to be engaged in a certain amount of experimentation in these rules to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what fits, what doesn't fit. And therefore, this experimentation means that even societies with identical preferences or identical circumstances may end up doing a lot of things that are actually different, which will mean that their rules about how markets are regulated or governed will differ as a result. Now, what does globalization, what does economic globalization do? What it does is essentially join markets with very different kinds of rules, and therefore creating arbitrage opportunities among these different kinds of rules. And what that leads to is a gap between the de facto rules in a society embodied in its existing arrangements and the de jure rules, the opposite, between the de jure rules, that is the rules that are embodied in the existing rules and standards, and the de facto rules, the ones that are actually the ones that are being carried out. And that, I think, is what creates a dissonance between the social contracts that are implicit in our social arrangements and the prevailing de facto practices. Okay, so far, I think I've conceptually sort of made a little bit of an entry, but it's still conceptual and abstract and fairly unclear as to what kind of purchase this has over anything in the real world. So the next step in my argument is to actually try to make this a little bit more concrete. I will pick this argument about the potential of undermining a social contract in the context of distributive justice, in the context of what kind of redistributions we are likely to accept and what kind we would not accept as a society, and how globalization impinges on that choice by trying to make that very concrete in a series of thought experiments. Now, the thought experiment is going to involve redistribution. When I talk about this in class, I usually pick two students in the front row, and I just say that let's call them Harry and John, and I'll say that suppose I'm proposing the following change, that Harry is going to be richer by $6 and John is going to be poorer by $5. Okay, so what I've engineered now is somebody gains $6 and somebody loses $5. There's a net gain of $1. And then I turn to the class and say, it's up to us as a society to decide whether we're going to condone or accept this change or not. So how do you vote on this? Would you would you accept this? Now, at this point, I don't get many students to raise their hands one way or another because it's too abstract. They want to know more about the circumstances. Who is Harry? Who is John? What actually happened for one of them to win $6, the other to lose $5? And in the absence of that information, they can't actually tell me whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So this is where the concrete experiment starts to come in. So I tell them, suppose the story is this, that Harry and John are actually two firms that compete with each other. And what has happened is that Harry has outcompeted John, has done better, and which results in Harry becoming much better off, in my example, by $6. And John and his employees lose their jobs, and they're worse off by $5. But the overall economic pie is bigger, because now we have a $1 of net gain. Okay, the question is sort of what exactly is the mechanism through which this competitive outcome has taken place. The first one is the way that this has worked out is that Harry has actually sort of worked day and night. He's invested a lot, he's saved a lot, he's come up with better products, higher quality product, is innovated, and has managed to drive John out of business. John has been lazy this whole time, hasn't been able to keep up with new technologies, hasn't saved and invested enough. Okay? So at this point, when I turn to the students, are you okay with this? What do you think about this change? The overwhelming majority willing to accept this change because now they've understood this as a kind of a legitimate kind of a market exchange, market competition. I don't know if we were in a different area where sort of market, our way of thinking about markets had not become so ingrained, whether they, how people would have responded. But today, everybody sort of, among students at least, everybody says that this is okay. So we accept this. So we're not going to intervene in this, even though we have somebody who's worse off, maybe some workers unemployed and so forth. Then I change the thought experiment, and I say what really happened is that Harry has found a cheap supplier in Germany, either a cheaper supplier or a supplier that is able to produce a higher quality input for what Harry produces. And what has happened is exactly the same outcome as a result. Harry is better off by 6. John cannot compete with him, and so he's run out of business. And then I say sort of, what do you think about this? Are you willing to condone this? Now, this depends a little bit on the audience, but I think certainly by far the majority of Harvard students will say that this is okay. That there's no problem with that. They'll sort of intuitively feel that this isn't not that different from the first case. The first case was just sort of market competition in a domestic setting. The second was just international competition, outsourcing to another supplier. Now, this is a point to stop at which and to sort of use it as another kind of a teaching point, not about ethics, but really about economics, which is to say that what we've orally learned from this is that that trade is really analogous to technological progress, that they are formally the same things, that in the two cases, we have exactly the same outcomes. And in the first case, it was achieved through technological progress. In the same case, it's achieved through trade. In fact, trade might even be better because Harry didn't have to undertake any investment or work any harder. All he had to do was find a cheaper supplier, in this case in Germany. So if there was a presumption that we should allow technological progress to take its course, even if it creates losers, presumably there's a very similar presumption also in the case of trade, or at least that seems to be what sort of the intuitive feeling of most of my students is. Now, I should be clear that it is not the case that just because one is technology, we never intervene in it. Technology is also constrained by our rules. But in this case, those rules don't seem to bite, or at least don't seem to rule out what actually happened. Now, if it turns out that Harry had experimented on humans or animals in order to sort of get ahead, then we might have thought differently about it. So then the thought experiment C is that another kind of trade, another kind of outsourcing. And what Harry has done is to outsource to a supplier in Bangladesh, which employs child workers in extremely long shifts under very hazardous conditions. He locks them up in a factory and so forth. All the sort of horror stories that you've heard about sweatshops in Bangladesh. And the question is, okay, so what do you think about this? Should we condone this change? Once again, the outcomes for Harry and John are the same. But the manner in which these gains and losses have been generated is somewhat different. In particular, what Harry has done is do something that we would not have condoned him to do in a domestic setting. Now, the answers that I'm going to get now will depend often on how much economics training my audience has had. If they have not been exposed to much economics, the vast majority will say they have problems with this, that this is not the kind of trade that they would condone, and that they would say that this is illegitimate, that this is the kind of trade that they would want to restrict, even though, mind you, this is the kind of trade that you cannot restrict by the rules of the World Trade Organization. That is, if you were to restrict this kind of trade, Bangladesh could take you to court and they would win. Because existing trade rules do not allow you to impede trade or impose restrictions on trade on the basis of how the labor are treated. The only exception is prison labor, which is not allowed. So on the other hand, and I should say that my intuition accords with that answer. And that's where I would come out as well, that I would say that this is not legitimate trade. It is not a legitimate trade precisely because it allows our domestic producers to do something to trade which they would not have been allowed to do through domestic exchanges. In other words, therefore undermines our existing social norms embedded in our own domestic understandings through the back door, so to speak, through the mechanism of trade. Now, I said that if I have in my audience a lot of economists, they will have, for them, there's the other answer, which is to say, well, trade is trade. Comparative advantage is comparative advantage. It doesn't necessarily matter. And they might say, besides, perhaps these Bangladeshi children aren't worse off because the alternatives might be better. So they might try to bring in something I haven't brought so far. What is the effect on other countries? And I haven't done so because the principle of trade is not to confer, the principle of gains from trade is not to confer benefits to other countries, but actually to make your own economy work better. So I'm keeping that slightly different, although I'll come back to issues of what happens to other countries and cosmopolitanism in a second. But to those economists who would say, no, you shouldn't interfere, the World Trade Organization rules are appropriate, you should not intervene in this kind of trade, you should let it go ahead, then I give them my scenario D. The scenario D is exactly like scenario C, except that what has happened is that Harry has brought these Bangladeshi workers into the United States, and is employing them in the United States under temporary contracts, but is employing them under Bangladeshi labor standards, not under US labor standards. Now, so my economist friends in the audience will understand, first of all, that this is illegal. Okay, so even if they found that this should not be illegal, at least they recognize that it's illegal. So this is formally completely identical to case C, but of course it's completely ruled out. It's ruled out by our laws. And I think many of them at this point sort of might say, okay, maybe the question is, if we were to accept, if we reject D, why would we actually not reject C as well? Okay. Alternatively, if we are willing to accept C, why aren't we willing to accept D as well? So my own response to this is that I would reject both C and D. But the point, however, is that if we're making decisions over these things, that it should be decisions that are made openly and discussed and deliberated. And it should be in this form that we're discussing these conditions about sort of what are the gains from trade versus what does it do to our own institutions? And that if we do decide that maybe C is okay, that it is done in an informed, deliberated way, rather than through the back door of trade agreements that reject the possibility of such tensions in the first instance. So, so summarizing sort of this part of my argument, globalization is going to generate winners and losers, just as technological change and domestic market competition does. But globalization is dissimilar insofar it forces competition under ground rules that we may have prohibited at home, such as unfair labor practices, tax havens, subsidized goods, and the sense in which, therefore, globalization has the potential to undermine social contracts is precisely by evading these pre-existing understanding and rules through the mechanisms of trade or international capital flows. That's what happens in the area of tax rules when investors put their money in tax havens, or when they force their governments to lower their corporate taxation by essentially threatening to leave, so the downward race to the bottom in corporate taxation. That's what happens in regulatory arbitrage in the areas of financial regulation or in terms of product safety rules, that if you do not lower your rules, that you will be undercut or will be undercompeted, outcompeted by producers in other settings operating under laxer standards, and more generally in terms of undercutting domestic norms about sort of what's an acceptable redistribution, what's an acceptable norms with respect to employee bargaining norms that are pre-existing in exactly the kind of way that I try to highlight with the thought experiments. And I think that's to me is the valid or the legitimate core of the arguments about fair trade. The notion that there is the possibility of what one might call social dumping that makes trade potentially unfair. My example with Germany is to highlight that, in fact, just because there's a potential that not all kinds of trade are necessarily raise this problem. The trade with Germany didn't, because labor standards in Germany are much, much better than the ones in the United States. So the issue doesn't really arise there. It's hard to say that that is sort of unfair competition, whereas it might be if you're competing with firms that are not sort of, ravaging the environment or treating their workers very, very poorly, or are receiving hidden subsidies from their governments. So I think, in a way, the quote from Pierre-Rosan Vallon here sort of gets at the core of the issue that when we think about distributive justice, it's really not necessarily that inequality per se, but sort of perceptions about whether that inequality has been generated fairly or not. And I think this is also an important reason why I believe that trade becomes politically so much contested in political discussions. So one thing that economists have a lot of trouble with is the idea that, by all accounts, if you look at deindustrialization, the stagnation of median wages, the low employment to labor ratio, all the ills of the labor market in the United States of the last 2 or 3 decades, the rising inequality, by all accounts, trade and globalization have contributed a relatively small share as a cause. Most of the rest is accounted by patterns of technological change, sort of deregulation at home, new set of understanding about the role of the state, and all of that. So the domestic reasons rather than trade. So the question that puzzles them is why does trade, sort of get picked up so much? Why does it get to be politically so contentious? So the usual answer is that it's so much easier to pick on the foreigners. So you can point to the Chinese and the Mexicans as the culprits. So it makes for a convenient scapegoat. But this discussion suggests that there might be another reason as well, that the reason trade is contentious is precisely because it raises questions about procedural fairness in ways that domestic technological progress or other changes domestically do not raise. So that has the consequence that trade looms larger. And I think that issue has been magnified and aggravated precisely by the reluctance of economists and our policy technocrats, our centrist political elites, to deny the very existence of the problem I'm trying to highlight, namely social dumping, or the problem that social contract might be, under certain circumstances, threatened by particular kinds of trade. And that denial effectively has the effect of tarring a larger part of trade with this problem than would be the case if we were upfront about it and be willing to make those kinds of distinctions. And therefore, somebody like, I think, Trump is able to say all the trade with Mexico, all the trade with China is tarred with this sort of broad brush of unfairness. Whereas if we're able to make some distinctions as to when it is fair, when it is not, if we're willing to go part of the way there on the basis of what I think is a legitimate and valid argument, perhaps we might have stopped shorter and at a more at a better point. So the last aspect of the last version of the thought experiment is to change this a little bit and ask the question: how would we think if Harry brings these workers into the U.S. Again under temporary contracts, so they're not immigrants, they're not going to be immigrants, they're just temporary workers. but employs them now in conformity with US labor laws. Okay? So they're not being exploited by our standards. So how would we think about this? So in this case, sort of the way that I think about it is that there is no real argument about sort of major problem of fairness with respect to procedural fairness, or at least the procedural fairness argument loses its case because we're treating these workers fairly. So you cannot make the argument that you're imposing a distributive burden on me by doing things that you would not have been allowed to do in a domestic setting. But this might have some very adverse consequences on people who may not be particularly rich, or it might be people who we feel are already at the bottom of the income distribution. So if we don't want our workers to get hurt, how are we going to trade off now some of the losses to particular workers or communities in the home economy in the United States versus the very large gains that are now at issue for these Bangladeshi temporary workers in the United States? Okay, so now it seems to me that we do have to confront the issue of how cosmopolitan we want to be and how we would actually undertake this kind, because we're now dealing with a different facet of globalization. It's not trade and outsourcing and the issue of fairness of trade, but issue of labor mobility, the questions of people, labor mobility, but circumstance when you're actually treating workers from other countries like you treat workers of your own. Now, my shortcut here is to take just the pure utilitarian approach. Since there's not an issue of distributive, the issue of distributive justice doesn't present itself as a kind of a principle. So I'm happy to be a utilitarian. And to make the notion of utilitarianism here operational, I'm going to ask a specific question. And the specific question is going to be that we currently have in the United States restrictions on workers being able to come in this hypothesized way. And that's what's keeping wages here for similar workers so much higher than the wages that they earn back home. So the question I'm going to ask is, what is the implicit weight on the utility of people on the other side of the border that would justify the current restrictions on labor mobility? And if that weight is much, much lower than the weight that we attach to our own, then we might say, well, maybe this is not legitimate. And we can operationalize this very simply, just with some kind of a back of the envelope kind of calculation. I'm not going to go through here. And the result of this exercise, all the key assumptions are in smaller font there. The key result is that to justify our current level of restrictions on labor mobility, that is to say, to justify keeping the Bangladeshi workers out rather than allowing them to come in, requires that we value a worker on the other side of the border at less than 22% of our own. That is to say, maybe between 1/4 and 1/5 of our own. So we need to put a very little weight. Now, is 20% too high or too low? Okay, my view is that it's basically too low. My intuition would be for me that I'm willing to accept that I put a smaller utility weight on somebody on the other side of the border for a wide range of reasons, but I'm less willing to accept that that weight is going to be as low as 0.2, as 1/5 of somebody domestically. So that utilitarian argument suggests to me that given how restrictive our current regulations are, you actually don't have to be highly cosmopolitan, or to put it, you need to be only a mild cosmopolitan, very mild cosmopolitan, to be willing to accept an expansion in the number of workers coming from poor countries. In other words, to accept my scenario 5, where Bangladeshi workers are coming in. And the case for doing so would become much stronger if we add in a lot of other benefits that this kind of labor mobility might generate. For the purposes of this exercise, I've only traded off the wage losses to competing workers at home versus the wage gains to the Bangladeshi workers. But if you add in that there will be some other gainers in the US, that there might be dynamic effects and so forth, the case for that would be even larger. But it's critical that the reason I get this 20%, that relatively low number, is because the barriers are so high to begin with. That means that the gains from relaxing it at the margin are very large. If the barriers were much lower, in other words, we're already accepting a lot of workers from abroad, then we would get a weight that might be 75%, 8%, 90%. What would I think of in those cases? I'm not so sure. So this is rendered, this decision, at least on a utilitarian calculus, is rendered rather easy one in favor of letting more workers in. So let me just sum up where I've come up with on all of this. So here's the bottom line. A is okay, B is okay, C I said is no, D is no, because it's also illegal. E is a conditional okay. It's conditional because you can't make a general, I'm not unable to make a general conclusion, but I'm saying conjuncturally, that's at our current state of the world economy and with current level of restrictions on labor mobility, I think a partial or marginal relaxation of these labor restrictions would make sense, even if you're very mild cosmopolitan. So you don't really have to be a globalist or a real cosmopolitan to really think that that makes sense. Okay, so trade is like technological progress. We do not have to be cosmopolitans or globalists in the least to allow it. We do not block redistributive exchanges as long as procedural fairness or the notion of a level playing field is not violated. And I think the implication of this is, one point I try to sort of emphasize that the procedural fairness constraint establishes limits to how much globalization we can have. Now, the much harder question becomes in practice, how then we determine specifically what those constraints are. My thought experiment made it rather easy because I gave you a case where the Bangladeshi workers were really treated very, very badly. What would it be if instead I would say that they get a minimum wage that's 10% of the minimum wage in the United States? How would you judge that? Well, on the one hand, 10% is very low. On the other hand, you might say, well, if their productivity is only 10% as high, maybe 10%, a minimum wage that's 10% is not unfair. So the question is going to be, we can't just read off strictly what's in our laws and regulations. Would need to look behind in terms of what's the implied intent in our laws and regulations to figure out whether, in fact, there is a real tension or not. But I think where I come out of this is that if we think about this in this particular way, that we don't really have to, we can actually sustain significant amounts of economic globalization without really sort of, again, this word globalism has snuck into my notes. What I mean by that, without thinking that we need to be, cosmopolitans, we don't, that we care more about international equality than we care about domestic equality, even if we care about, the sovereignty, if we care about our own domestic social arrangements and so forth. And the final thing I will say is just to make a distinction, which is, even though I say we can have a lot of economic globalization, I think the direction in which I've tried to take you and a sort of direction in which my own thinking goes is that it does make actually a critical difference about the way we think about economic globalization and the way that we think about what multilateral institutions or the rules of globalization ought to be doing. And here I think it's useful to distinguish between what I call hyper-globalization and alternatively democracy and enhancing globalization. Hyper-globalization, I would say, is essentially the path that we've been on since the 1990s. I would describe it very briefly as a system that justifies any and all external rules that restrict domestic policy space so as to minimize the transactions costs associated with national borders. So the point is to maximize the volume of trade by minimizing transactions costs at the border. That's what hyperglobalization is. In trade, in finance, this is largely what we've been after with international agreements. I would say this is very different from a kind of globalization that focuses on actually on enhancing democracy, that it would impose only those and mostly procedural restrictions on the national policy space that enhance deliberation and are consistent with democratic delegation. So it would be okay for international rules that say that any policy that has implications for other countries have to be justified on the basis of a transparent decision-making process. That they have to be justified on the basis of an economic, scientific cost-benefit calculus. That they have to be deliberated and they have to be reached in fora that are more broadly accountable and representative, and so on. So these are procedural demands that I think a global multilateral system and global economic system might legitimately make on national decision making, but it wouldn't presume the outcomes. It wouldn't presume any particular degree of harmonization in the regulatory outcomes that come out of that process and would allow the diversity to prevail. Okay. Let me just stop here.
Yeah, just immediately, I think, you talk about bringing the Bangladeshi workers in, and then you talk about democracy. You're bringing in people who are temporary employees, who you do not see as having a track to citizenship. And if you want to support democracy, I would have thought you'd be more concerned about citizens who are going to be participating in the political process being the ones who do not feel or do not have their economic standards lowered. Just from the point of view of, not humanitarian considerations, but democracy. Walzer, for example, has a very particular view in his earlier work about it being wrong to have temporary workers who see no role, no hope for citizenship, and the effect of that on democracy. So I just think that's a point to consider. The other thing is bringing in workers as opposed to paying higher wages in Bangladesh. I mean, why isn't it an option, right? I mean, you're going to be paying them more to bring them in any case, under the proposal, the next to the last proposal, I believe it was, where you would actually go with U.S. requirements. You can achieve probably more good for Bangladesh at the same cost to the U.S. economy by simply paying the Bangladeshis more in Bangladesh. So why do you choose to import the workers rather than export the money?
The answer to the second question is because they would be much more productive in the United States than they are in Bangladesh, because there's all that structure of institutions of a modern economy that makes them much more productive in the United States. So they could never be as productive in Bangladesh as they would be in the United States, and therefore.
That wasn't mentioned, and then you seem to have to weigh again. You have to weigh increased productivity against other factors. So this is another element in the argument. Right?
So let me come to your first point. So I didn't get into this question of whether you want to simply consider a temporary labor mobility scheme, or you want to sort of consider them as potential immigrants with a path to citizenship. I don't have a very strong views about this, and I just wanted to very distinctly keep the citizenship immigration issue separate from the question about economic globalization. So that was the strategy to why he kept. But with regard to the substance of what you're saying, I mean, my thinking would be that for good or bad, we have a system of nation states with their own decision-making powers. And conditional on that system existing, I would say that each country in its own democratic way has the right to decide how many immigrants it wants to accept. So I would say that that's within the remit of that democracy. Now, in that, you can make arguments both ways. So you want to provide these people more citizenship, or you want to provide them less citizenship. But what I do not want to happen is I do not want to happen a case where citizens decide they do not want more immigrants, but that they would be willing to accept temporary workers in a circumstances where the economic benefits to those temporary workers are very, very large. And they would very gladly take that path to, let's say, a 5-year contract of making a lot of money in the United States where they can save for themselves and their family and remit, and then go back. And I don't want that argument on immigration to be an obstacle to these people who might improve their lives in a very significant way on an economic basis.
As the welfare of the people who are citizens and who are actively involved in democracy goes down. That's the other side of this, because you said that those workers who are citizens will not,
Right.
will lose. And
Right.
so I'm saying that may have an impact on the democratic nature and the activity of the democracy.
Well, if that is the instrumental argument, I would say then I would then definitely keep them out. No, if that is the judgment, if somebody provides a good argument as to this is going to create so much inequality, because my utilitarian calculus was to say that the damage was going to be limited by the wage impact, the downward wage impact. Now you're saying it's not just that, but that downward wage impact is going to be compounded and magnified by a whole bunch of political implications. That's going to make our democracy work so much worse. By the argument, extending the argument to that eventuality, of course, then I would have to say, no, that's not something we want to do.
So thank you for your presentation. And my question has to do with your scenario 5. And I hear what you're saying in terms of having these Bangladeshis come here and be paid at the same rate and so on. But underlying that is a question that seems to touch on the distribution among labor between American workers who might be slightly disadvantaged and Bangladeshi workers who would stand to benefit a lot. But in your presentation, there's no discussion as to how this impacts the distribution between labor and capital, between those who run these global corporations, the huge disparity in income globally, and how one addresses that aspect of it. If you don't have the rules domestically that reduce the income disparity, then bringing in these Bangladeshi workers might in fact exacerbate the already existing huge disparity. So how would you address that? That would be my question.
Well, I mean, I think my answer to the question of how does this affect domestic income disparities is to say, yes, I'm taking that into account, but by my sort of mildly cosmopolitan social welfare function is telling me that it is still okay because we're making substantially poorer people in the rest of the world so much better off that we as a society were willing to accept that. It would be far better, of course, if we can think of compensation and other safety nets to take care of our own. But I'm just saying that let me put it this way: that the greatest source of inequality in the world today is not inequality within countries; it's inequality between countries, and therefore anything you do along the lines of E is going to have a first-order impact on global inequality. If you if you don't believe borders matter. And my operationalization of this was precisely to ask the question: how much should borders matter for me not to want to do this. But you may want to find yourself on the other side. You might say 0.22 is too high. Actually, I really, given how much I care about domestic disparities, I don't want to aggravate them even in the slightest bit. So this is a case where there is a real tension between domestic equality and international equality. And I don't know of any other way to get at this. And this is really where it really bites the most, is in labor mobility, because it would be the most direct way in which you can address global inequality, although it would come at the expense of domestic equality. Now, you can think of all kinds of domestic institutional engineering, right? Give every worker in the United States a share of the capital stock that the wealthy have, then that's not a problem, because then all the gains to the capital owners that you get from labor coming in gets redistributed back to workers, and you don't have this problem anymore. So,
whether Harry seems to be benefiting quite a bit here from this schema that you put together, and doesn't seem to be affected by whatever scenarios, all the different scenarios you've laid out. He's benefiting. Saying you need to get at the distribution between Harry and everybody else.
I don't disagree.
And,
I have no disagreement with that.
Actually, my question follows up on the same themes. I'm neither an economist nor a philosopher. I'm a student of the law, so I will try to complicate perhaps a little bit your notion of social contract, laws, norms, labor laws, protections, etc. I think you take a little bit, perhaps a view that they are more autonomous of what you are describing than they really are, because in some ways you can take a look at what you said and perhaps posit that what is going on in terms of arbitrage between sort of various labor protection regimes and sort of those differences and capital sort of using that to that advantage. You can say that it actually is also the other way around, perhaps, that this is constitutive of and a reason why labor protections in Germany are high and in the US are high is because capital can do this. So it's not just that they are fleeing away from labor laws or that social contract, but that very social contract takes into account and is in itself constituted by that option for capital to amass and to produce and to do what it has to do through these other ways. And so the relationship sort of goes both ways, which raises the question of whether if that is not allowed, that type of arbitrage is not allowed by some scenario, by raising the labor standards, that it just wouldn't hold. You can't hold this constant because it just reflects, it will have to reflect a new capital labor arrangement.
Let me understand what you're saying, because I'm not sure I understood. Are you saying that there is an implicit social contract that between labor and capital in Germany, let's say, that says you will get high levels of labor protection in Germany. In return, you will allow me to be globally mobile and source as well as I want? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's not necessarily as direct as that, but that the contract reached in the U.S. or Germany is or factors in, not necessarily dependent, but factors in the idea that capital can do what it does outside. And so you can look at a scenario where you can't just raise the standard across all, holding the social contract, and raises the question of whether, and this is really a question of whether it is possible to have the same labor standards across all, or whether there will just be a new equilibrium where there will be a loss to the from that perspective to the workers, not just the non-workers, but also the workers in the better protected countries, that the new equilibrium will be less for the social contract, will be less than what it is now for the richer countries, but definitely better for Bangladesh.
I mean, I understand the force of your argument, which I take it to be that you have to read the underlying social contract well, and that I gave I wasn't very explicit about what the social contract was. but that you need to have that, because to take your extreme example, if the social contract was, to begin with, that German capital was free to go to Bangladesh and outsource and produce as it wants and then bring those goods back in return for German workers getting their protections and their transfer payments at home, then obviously it doesn't make sense to go back and say you're violating. But my reading of, so I think that would be ahistorical, that would be counterfactual, because I would say that the social contract in Germany that generated those high labor protections was arrived at a much earlier period when capital was not mobile, and that the mobility of capital came through a number of different, and then you'd have to show me now that labor and society assented to that mobility in the full realization of all the implications that would generate for the domestic social arrangements. But I think that would be a useful discussion to have, because I think that's exactly the implication of my story.
Thank you for this great talk. I just love the way you work these scenarios. You apologize too much at the beginning for not being a philosopher. I think you have this in hand. I think, though, that while you establish very much and you're able to tweak our underlying thoughts about justice, both distributive justice and procedural justice, I don't see how most of your presentation illuminates what you're calling, well, one dilemma of the trilemma, the dilemma between democracy and globalization, because all of our intuitions here are driven, I think, by our ideas of justice. You're too smart to realize to claim that democracy is simply about what the majority believes, right? So you introduce, and you understand we're talking about representative democracies. So you introduce this thing called implicit social contract. But I'm not really sure where that comes from, how you ground it. Pardon the quip, but to paraphrase our former colleague Bob Nozick, implicit social contracts aren't worth the paper they're not written on. I don't know how you pick that out, right? So the way I would approach it is that it would have to be formally, right? And we have no formal way of identifying what you're talking about other than what our laws actually are. If you think that you have a way of identifying an implicit social contract whose violation is somehow a violation of democracy, then I don't even know where you begin. How would you identify then a completely domestic change in law? We're about to undergo what the White House is calling tax reform. How would you identify whether or not whatever comes out of this Congress, if anything comes out, as a violation of an implicit social contract? It's legislation. Presumably, the difference between D and some of these things some are legal and some aren't legal. You are already committed to the idea that a formal legal process is legitimating in some way, right? These countries sign on to trade agreements that they don't have to sign on to, and you agree that there is forms of perfectly acceptable democratic delegation. You couldn't argue sensibly otherwise. So I don't see there's this kind of magical thing that's going on here, what you're calling an implicit social contract whose violation is supposed to set up the dilemma, but I don't see it working because I don't see where you get this implicit social contract from. And if you, just one more point, you could see it going, of course, in the other direction. So suppose the implicit social contract around here is that we don't let women into the workforce, so we don't let them drive. It turns out globalization is great for bashing that implicit social contract and making life better for women, and you presumably be totally for that, right? So can it be that the implicit social contract just matches what good, right-thinking people think are the right substantive standards of justice, in which case, again, democracy just kind of falls out of it, and you're making a very sensible argument about justice.
Well, I mean, you're right to the extent that, the way that I set it up, I'm not. I guess I would say I'm presuming, both a minimalist, the concept of democracy I have in the background is both narrower than what we think about democracy. It's narrower in the sense that it hangs on sort of broad participation and deliberation, but also a little bit more beyond that narrow concept, because it just presumes that there is some kind of a social contract. Now, I don't think the issue of whether you figure out that there is a social contract, how you would figure it out, I don't think that's a big problem. I mean, I think for that we have political scientists and historians, and I think they can tell us that there were certain understandings in the 50s and 60s until the oil shock that sort of got reversed and so forth. So let me put it this way, I haven't thought too hard and long to give you a very principled exposition on how I would figure out what the social contract is. But what I can say, I would be very disappointed if I could not generate that argument, and I would, then I would cede you the ground. But what I would say is that you just, I think one of the points I'm trying to make is you cannot, and I think this would have been obvious to maybe sort of, that just because a democracy does it, you cannot necessarily say it's democratically legitimate, right? So I think that's what I'm trying to get at. And I think when you say, just let's make it concrete. When you sort of you pass a trade agreement, NAFTA, and then you have a bunch of, economists and administration, you negotiate it through a process that keeps a lot of domestic stakeholders out. And then you ratify it through a process where you really obfuscate what is going on in terms of the agreement. Then you can sort of make an argument that the mechanism through which this country has engaged into an international agreement doesn't satisfy certain standards of democratic legitimacy. I think that would be my argument. Now, and that would sort of fit with the notion of social contract. I have nothing against the social contract changing, but I think we need to sort of have to, I think it was Nozick, that's right, any distribution that is the result of an initial distribution arrived at legitimately, right? He does have this notion. So I think there would be some kind of a notion like that you would have to just judge that the distribution is arrived at, the new distribution arrived at through an explicit reconsideration of these basic principles. I'm not being very deep here, but I think I disagree about the vacuousness of the social contract notion.
I wanted to ask about the contrast between, or the argument that you seem to be making from D to C. And I agree in this case that both D and C are wrong. But it doesn't seem to me that a general inference of the form, if it's wrong to bring in workers and violate these rules at home, then it's wrong to outsource to people who violate those rules. So if we make it a less kind of morally laden case and we say someone in a company in Europe where GMO foods are illegal outsources some work to a company in America whose employees are happier because they have all the tasty GMO foods. And maybe their cafeteria is cheaper because they get to, serve them the tasty GMO foods. That's illegitimate. That doesn't seem right. And yet, of course, bringing in the American workers and serving them the GMO foods, given that they're illegal in Germany, wouldn't be okay. And just generally moving from the wrongness of D to C to the wrongness of C would seem to kind of rule out any kind of outsourcing unless we have the same norms and regulations across all nations. And so I'm wondering kind of when we can move from D being wrong to C being wrong and when we can't, and if there's a way of distinguishing between the norms that we need to kind of uphold with our outsourcing and the ones that we don't.
I mean, my main answer to your question is that our approach to economic globalization and would be infinitely better if we're actually precisely discussing these questions, which we are not. So the question is, yes, I mean, in practice, I've taken the rather easy cases, so we can make some distinctions to see that there are distinctions to be made. But in a lot of cases, I gave sort of an example. I mean, if it's a question of not, child workers in 12-hour day shifts in extremely hazardous conditions, but simply very low minimum wages, are you going to say no? And my answer would be that I can imagine a process of informative discussion and deliberation where you can go through, and in the end, reasonable people may still disagree, but at least we've had the discussion, and the answer and the result is reached after due deliberation. That's what I think about I think that's what I would think gives the process democratic legitimacy, as opposed to the current process where we're not even accepting the legitimacy of having that discussion in the first place. So, in the case of the low minimum wage, I can imagine an argument going back and forth, saying some people saying no, this looks like a very low wage, and the other side saying, but you have to bear in mind that these people, they're still making much more than they would be back in the countryside, or that their productivity is very low. That's why their wages are low, and that's why you have to bear that in mind. And the other side might come up with another argument. I don't know where you're going to, and there's going to be a lot of borderline cases, and you might very well say that burden of proof is on one side, and rule it that way. But it's always going to be controversial in a lot of the real world cases. But the question is this a discussion worth having? And I think it's worth having. And I think a lot of our problems with globalization have to do with our rejection of this, the need to have this discussion in the first place.
To help along that deliberation that you want us to have, I'd like to explore C a little bit further and ask you if you would favor, as I think you might, changing the WTO or changing the agreements that we enter into globally to require something like social and economic rights. And if you don't want to call them rights, which is fine, I don't want to right-like things, so that we decide that A, B, and C, and D are off limits. And it's perfectly all right for countries to put on tariffs or or ban entirely products from countries that don't meet those requirements. Now, WTO doesn't at the moment do that. In fact, it explicitly doesn't do that. And I assume that you would oppose that WTO at the present moment and want to change it. And that's part of the deliberation. I'm sort of surprised that you didn't come to that. If that's what you want us to be deliberating about, why didn't you say so?
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I've written about that, and I do think that. So, I mean, and I think there's a precedent in the WTO regime that could be used for this purpose, because there is an anti-dumping regime, and the anti-dumping regime is a very protectionist regime that is there for a very bad reason, to produce, simply provide protection for firms. But the notion, the idea behind the anti-dumping regime in world trade law is unfair trade, unfairness. That somebody's undercutting you by selling in your market below cost. So I would actually extend that notion to social dumping, which is to say that there are circumstances under which can make legitimately the argument that trade involves the undercutting of your domestic social arrangements. I think the hard thing is to then require certain institutional procedures to ensure that this does not devolve into, their minimum wage is too low, and therefore we're going to keep that product high. And my defense, when I argue with my economist friends who say, but that's just slippery slope to protectionism, my defense is to say, well, look, if the anti-dumping regime, which is explicitly protectionist, hasn't brought the world trading regime down, a well-designed social dumping with appropriate procedural prerequisites surely won't do it. So I think, yes, that's the direction in which I would go.
Thanks for your talk. My question's about what happens in scenario E if you don't keep US labor law constant? Because it seems to me that one really reasonable outcome of bringing a lot of temporary workers who have no possibility of citizenship to the United States, where there's already quite a bit of regional variation in labor law, would be diminishing the power of workers in the political process. And that even if, say, Harry and John are in Illinois, let's say, even doing this a few times with a few Harry and John-sized firms could actually have a quite detrimental impact on U.S. labor law. And I wonder if that sort of affects your model at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I mean, I will give the same answer that I gave to Francis, which is to say that, well, this is an empirical question. So if somebody is able to mount a good argument that the consequences of letting these workers in goes beyond the somewhat modest, adverse wage impact on the directly affected workers, but has these, causes a chain of events that's going to, in the end, create the same effect that C and D did, which was to undermine existing social arrangements. Yes, I think by the same token, I would be against that. But that would be, it's an empirical question.
Brandon?
Thank you for the talk. I've got two questions that come out of, I think, the implicit reference in a lot of these topics of the sort of banning wing of the right. And so,
I'm sorry, say that again?
the sort of Steve Bannon economic.
No, the beginning of your sentence.
Well, no, I was just trying to ask you two questions that are based on some of the rhetoric that Bannon has used to excoriate so-called globalism.
Uh-huh.
And I just kind of want to see how you would respond given your arguments here. So two of the arguments that he makes that are always sort of striking to me. One is that he'll, we can argue about whether they're sincere or not, but he'll argue that one of the unique problems faced is that you've got historical disadvantages that accrue to certain populations in the United States, to African Americans, and that there may be a special consideration that should attend to them. Sorry, I guess the mic wasn't on. That there should be special considerations that should attend to making sure that they're employed, and that would change your kind of calculation about how much we value labor across the border. So given kind of historical injustices, trying to repair the democratic deficits that attend from entrenched, enduring historical injustice might require us to alter these calculations. And so my first question is just, what would you say about those particular kind of scenarios? And then the second is that the Bannon wing often uses the language of warfare to describe the kinds of globalization processes that you're talking about. And so I was curious as to what you thought that if a country was deeply committed, or an alliance of countries were deeply committed to the principles that you've outlined, what kind of positive interventions would they be justified in making to kind of undermine attempts to undermine their social arrangements, right? So would they be allowed to, one of the questions on the table was sanctions, but would you be able to do other things like withdraw military protection? I mean, that's one of the things that the Bannon wing has identified, is like withdrawing military protections from people who don't cooperate with us on certain kind of trade regimes. So I was just curious as to what you thought those kind of mechanisms of punishment and sanction might be that would be justified given the high stakes of these questions.
A lot of questions there. Now on the sort of the Bannon take on trade, I've never heard him say that we should have a trade policy so we can do a better job with for our historically disadvantaged communities. Is that? But I mean, I would be all for it if this is a trade policy is a good instrument for doing that, or there are other ways. What's keeping us doing that is our existing trade policy. So I have nothing against that. I mean, I think and also by the way, I have nothing against the view that Bannon and Trump trumpet, which is that our policies, including trade policies, should be in the national interest. The whole, when we teach as economists, we teach the notion of comparative advantage and the gains from trade. What we're doing is we're showing why trade is in the national interest. It's not. The point about free trade is not to confer benefits to other countries. The point is to expand, improve your own economic performance. So the issue, it's a red herring that this should be about national interest. The problem is the definition of the national interest and what kind of policies you would impose, and where I would, very strongly part ways with Bannon and company would be with, the prescribed policies of how you would carry out the national interest. In particular, going to the second part of your comment, the notion of viewing trade as, or economic relations among nations as a kind of an extreme competition that, you might characterize as war. I mean, as I said here, I mean, trade is as much war as technological progress is. I mean, trade is technological progress. It's analogous to technological progress. If you don't understand that, I think your whole approach to the way that you're approaching trade and globalization is going to be, wrong from the get-go. The point is to understand that just like technological progress, sometimes trade is going to, do things that is going to impinge on our moral values, on our social arrangements, on social understandings embedded in our rules and regulations. And just as we regulate technology, when we sort of have extensive rules about what kind of experiments you can do and not do on animals, we're going to regulate trade to ensure that the processes are consistent with. So I thinking about sanctions and all of that in the context of trade. I mean, just starting from a completely, I think, is the wrong starting point for this discussion for me.
And we've now come full circle to where you started in your lecture, so I think that's a good ending point for us right now. Let's thank